All right. Well, hi, everybody. We're moving back on to the fourth game now, and that's going to be between the Baltimore Ravens and the Tennessee Titans. Um, both teams barely snuck into the playoffs. Titans actually a division winner, but all came down to last week for these two teams to get in. Bully, it sounds like this is your favorite matchup, so I'll let you take it away. What are you most excited about for this one?
Oh, I'm excited about all of it, AJ. To me, when I saw the matchups, this was probably the game of the weekend, just because of the way that the Tennessee offense has played versus the Baltimore defense, who has been super strong all season long. And then just on the Baltimore offensive side of the football, just Lamar Jackson. I mean, it's always fun watching him and seeing what he's going to be able to pull off, especially against a Titans defense that, which we'll get to, is not very strong. So I just think there's a lot of compelling things in this one.
Yeah, I agree, and this is the perfect revenge game for the Ravens after they got bounced last year as the 1 seed to the 6 seed Titans. So a little bit of a role reversal here. They'll be playing in Tennessee instead of Baltimore, but perfect game for Baltimore fans.
And also, they could use a little revenge earlier. They had a really good game between these two earlier in the season. They won on a Derrick Henry touchdown, I think, in overtime. But let's get started with going through these comparisons. We'll go with the Ravens O-line versus the Titans D-line. Oh my God! Yeah, this looks right. We got the O-lines for the Ravens. They allowed 32 sacks on the year, which is 14th fewest in the NFL. So kind of in the middle of the pack. But when you have Lamar Jackson back there, and obviously when you're looking at this, 5.5 yards. That's 5.5 yards per carry for this Ravens team, which is most in the NFL. But when you got Lamar Jackson, that helps a ton. So this O-line's actually turned it on at the end of the year for this Ravens team. And then looking at this Titans team, the one thing they are good at, I mean, they can't really get to the quarterback, only 19 sacks on the season, but they do force a lot of the fumbles, which is third most in the NFL, which this Ravens team running a lot, that could be a huge factor. So you guys giving the advantage to in this one?
I'm going to give the advantage to the Ravens O-line. They have certainly taken a big hit after oh boy, I just had his name.
Marshall
and I'm just
Yanda
blanking today.
Yep.
Marshall Yanda. Thank you. It's real bad today, but yeah, since he retired after last year, it certainly took a big hit for him. And you can tell as they were, literally middle of the pack of, sacks allowed. I do think a little bit of that is, sometimes Lamar maybe tries to make something out of something before he needs to, and then he gets himself into trouble, and that'll go obviously on the offensive line for giving up a sack. But I mean, Ben Powers is still pretty solid. DJ Fluker is no fluke, and Orlando Brown is still pretty solid. But I think, and I give the advantage too, because the Titans D line, Jeffrey Simmons is a first round pick, and I'm not going to say he's a bust by any means, because it's hard to say that after just 1 year, but he certainly hasn't quite lived up to the expectations that they had for him this year. So just a little bit of an underperforming unit. I think, maybe in a different year where they have a full training camp and, a preseason to get tuned up before the season, they might be a beneficiary of that.
Yeah, and Marshall Yanda was so good for so long that it's just like really hard to get my brain around the fact that they just don't have a dominant tackle on that team. So, but they don't. I mean, they've got some guys that are okay. I mean, Orlando Brown is solid. I don't think he is like top 10 in the league good, but I do think that he is a pretty solid tackle. And like you said, on Tennessee's side of the ball, it's going to be, I'm going to be honest, it's going to be really hard for me to say that the Titans have any edge that has anything to do with their defense this season.
That's fair. And we can move on to the running back matchup. Obviously, this is where the Ravens flourish. I added Lamar Jackson in here because he's a big part of that running attack. Obviously, they're first in the NFL at 191 yards per game, best in the NFL, and 24 touchdowns, third in the NFL. And then when you're looking at the other side of the ball, the Titans defense, they give up 4.5 yards per attempt, which is 14th most in the NFL. So in the middle of the pack, they're going to go up against this Ravens team that's just going to be running almost every down, except in downs where they need to pass. But it's going to be a tough matchup for this Titans team. But I'm going to throw it over to you guys. Who do you like in this matchup?
Yeah, again, so it was pretty easy. I obviously like the Ravens. I mean, Mark Ingram, obviously haven't seen much out of him this season. Last year, obviously a huge year, and this year kind of didn't really see much. We've seen a lot of Gus Edwards lately, and J.K. Dobbins kind of hit or miss, but when you've got Lamar Jackson running the football, those other guys don't even really particularly matter. You just need some semblance of a threat so he can run the read option. But other than that, yeah, he obviously leads that team in running the football.
Yeah, I agree. I think the only linebacker, I guess Harold Landry and Rashaan Evans are both solid, but I think their better years are behind him. Evans especially, I think he was elite, a couple of years ago, but probably on the downward trajectory of his career. But and a little surprised. I got to bring this up: the fact that we didn't really talk about Ronnie Stanley not even being on the offensive line for the Ravens, and obviously he got hurt early in the year, and he's out for the year. So a huge hit, and I think that could be a little bit of a reason why the running game hasn't been as great as it was last year, even though they still are the number one in the NFL in rushing yards per game. But as Paulie alluded to, that is mainly because of Lamar Jackson. But J.K. Dobbins has come on strong here at the end of the year. So I think that they are certainly going to want to run the ball much more and more effectively than they did last year against the Titans.
Yeah, and we can I probably don't even have to talk about this one too much because the Ravens are most likely just going to be running the ball. But we got these wide receivers for the Ravens going up against this Titans secondary. Obviously, their passing yards per game, 182, last in the NFL. They averaged 25 pass attempts per game, again, last in the NFL. Obviously they're going to be relying on the run, but looking at this Titans secondary, a lot of good names. Desmond King, Adoree Jackson, Malcolm Butler, Kevin Byard, Kenny Vaccaro, solid guys that they got in the back end. But yet they still somehow had averaged 277 yards passing per game, and that's fourth most in the NFL. And they gave up 36 passing touchdowns, which is second most in the NFL. So obviously they have all struggled, even though they have that talent. So who are you guys giving the advantage to in this one?
Advantage Titans secondary for the fact that there's just nothing flashy about Ravens receivers. I mean, Dez Bryant's had a few decent weeks, but no offense to Dez Bryant, if you got to bring in him after like week 12, like that speaks volumes about your receiving core. For a guy that didn't play in the NFL for like 2 years, and now you're just like, oh, we'll bring him in. He's going to make us better. And he almost has performed the best. I mean, Marquise Brown's had a few good weeks at the end of the year, but outside of the receivers, Mark Andrews is great. But there's just too much experience for the Titans secondary for me to pick against him.
And the Titans secondary is just a really hard one for me to just kind of come to grips with, because you look at the guys that they have. I mean, they obviously have a lot of talent in the secondary of that team. And then you look at the stats and you're like, well, maybe it's because the offense has been scoring so many points, where obviously you're just playing a little bit softer. You're going to be able to give up more yards and still win the football game in your secondary. But then I also think like the way that Derrick Henry is just chewing up clock every game, like you wouldn't think that their defense would be on the field for a ton of time, but yet they're still giving up all these yards and all these points. So it doesn't really make sense to me that they're ranked that low with the team that they have, but they are. And because of that, I mean, yes, there's not a ton of talent on the Baltimore side of football, but Mark Andrews, to me, is a top 5 tight end in the league. Marquise Brown, very inconsistent, played better in the second half of the season, but he always has that threat of going deep on you that you have to watch out for. And Lamar Jackson is only throwing it 20 times a game these days, but given the chance, I mean, we've seen what he's done in the past. So I don't know. It's probably a toss-up for me in this category.
Yeah, that's fair, but we can flip the script. We'll talk about the offense for the Titans against the defense of the Ravens. Didn't realize, but this is the number 1 and number 2 rushing attack in the league right now. I mean, granted, you have Derrick Henry, over 2,000 rushing yards, and the Ravens, all they do is run the ball. But if you would have told me that last year, the way Ryan Tannehill's throwing the ball around, I thought he would have had they would have passed the ball more, especially with the way A.J. Brown and Corey Davis have come on. But we'll talk about the Titans O-line right here. Obviously, the rushing yards per carry, I mean, maybe that helps with Derrick Henry as running back, but that's 5.2 yards, second most in the NFL. And they only give up 25 sacks on the year, which is 6th fewest in the NFL. So they've had a pretty solid year, even without, I think they lost their starting left tackle. I can't remember his name early in the year. The guy, Taylor Lewan, he always gets in the fights. I think he went down early this year, and but they've somehow held together. And looking at this D-line for the Ravens, a lot of big names, Calais Campbell, Matt Judon, Derek Wolfe. They only allowed 108 yards, rushing yards per game this season, which is 8th fewest. And only 39 sacks for this Ravens team this year. So who you give them the edge to in this matchup?
I think they're both pretty strong. And part of me is like, okay, well, is the running game, is it all Derrick Henry? It's got to be some of their offensive line. And the way that Ryan Tannehill has played this season, it seems like they've been protecting him pretty well and giving him a chance to throw the ball downfield. So I do think that Titans offensive line has performed really well this season. But you look at the Ravens defensive line, I mean, a stud nose tackle in Brandon Williams, and Calais Campbell, obviously getting up there in age, but he's still putting up numbers. He's still producing for that team. And overall, I think you just kind of give it to the Ravens based on the pedigree.
Yeah, and, Matt Judon and Derek Wolfe. I mean, Derek Wolfe signed, in the offseason from, Denver, and he's been a great ad. And it's just, you just keep coming with the defensive line for the Ravens. And that's why I think I give them the edge overall. If they did have Taylor Lewan, I, would be more inclined to go back to the Titans offensive line. But I mean, Bully did put it best. They are very solid on both sides. So that will be the deciding factor in this game. If the Ravens defensive line can create pressure and not necessarily just in the passing game, but if they can, stand put and not get pushed back on run plays, then this could be an interesting ball game.
All right, and since we're talking about Derrick Henry, we can bring up the running back core. I mean, there's Derrick Henry and Devontae Foreman. Obviously, as I said earlier, 168 rushing yards per game, second most in the NFL, and they had 26 rushing touchdowns, second most in the NFL, obviously behind the Saints. Huge help from Alvin Kamara there. And then you're looking at these Ravens linebacker, Patrick Queen's had a nice rookie season. Yannick Ngakoue is now there, and Farnell McPhee. And, this Ravens defense had a pretty good year, too. They've only allowed 19 points per game. But, this is probably going to be the big matchup is, will these guys be able to bring down Derrick Henry? So who are you guys giving the advantage to in this one?
I think too hard to go against Derrick Henry. I mean, you do look at the linebackers, though, for the Ravens, much to the same kind of mold as the line here. They're both very solid units. I mean, Derrick Henry is kind of the lone horse. I mean, Dante Foreman doesn't do much. I'm pretty sure like 168 of those yards, like 100, Derrick Henry gets 130 of them. So it's, it's really just him against those four. And that's still a testament to how good he is, that I would still even lean towards him having the advantage just because he is so huge. And I mean, Yannick Ngakoue isn't really a stand-up linebacker. He's more of your edge rusher, kind of the same thing with Pernell McPhee. But Tyus Bowser has been very solid, and Patrick Queen has had a great rookie year. So, like I said, still very solid, but I would still give the edge to Derrick Henry.
Yeah, I'm just thinking to myself, like, what kind of linebackers would a team have to have in order for me to say that the advantage doesn't go to Derrick Henry? I mean, the guy ran for 2,000 yards this season. He did it pretty much all of last season as well. I can't pick against Derrick Henry, especially with the season that he's had.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah, 2,000 yards for Derrick Henry. So nice for him. Yeah, it's hard to pick against that, like you said. But we'll move on to the last matchup where we're going for the Titans receivers against this Ravens secondary. Should be a fun matchup to see who's going to be on. You got A.J. Brown and Marcus Peters. That's probably going to be a matchup. Marlon Humphrey's had a solid year. Jimmy Smith has a solid year for the Ravens. And as you're looking at this, Corey Davis kind of came on as of late, and Jonnu Smith. So ton of weapons at Ryan Tannehill's disposal. But who you guys giving the advantage to in this one?
Yeah, this one's pretty juicy. I mean, I'm a big fan of A.J. Brown. I know I talk about it a lot, but when that guy gets the ball in his hands, he is so good after the catch. Like, for his size and the speed that he has, it's pretty unbelievable to me. And Corey Davis came along in the second half of the season. Jonnu Smith, it was really a consistent target for him all year long. And Ryan Tannehill last year was obviously not a fluke. You just had to get him out of Miami, and the guy is producing. But with all of that being said, I just think the Ravens secondary is so deep that I just can't put those young guys for Tennessee ahead of the Ravens overall as a unit in the secondary.
Yeah, and I agree with Bully. I think the Ravens secondary does have the slight edge because, pound for pound in terms of, performing at their position, I think they do have the slight edge. But and the reason for that, I guess, is because of the scheme that the Titans have. I mean, AJ kind of said, I'm a little surprised that, they ran the ball so much, and you thought that they were, throwing it much more with, the season that Ryan Tannehill has. But that's all because of Derrick Henry and the running game. They scheme very well. I think they have it down perfectly when, it infuriated me during the season because I had Derrick Henry in fantasy. And when they get to the 4-yard line, 3-yard line, Derrick Henry never runs it in because everybody is expecting him to get the ball, and Tannehill just bootlegs out to the right and not a soul is there. So that also, comes in, with the play action. Everybody thinks Derrick Henry's getting the ball every play, and you probably should because he can literally grab it every play and still be okay. So that's why they are effective. Not to say that Corey Davis, A.J. Brown, Jonnu Smith aren't great players in their own right, but just in terms of playing their position better, I'm going to have to go with the Ravens secondary.
All right, well, that brings it all the way around. Now it's time. This is probably the hardest matchup to pick from. But who do you guys got winning this game?
I am going to go with the Ravens. I think this is ripe for them to get that revenge game. They've gotten back to the kind of football that we thought they were going to play in the beginning of the year. They were my Super Bowl champion pick, so I can't go against that right now.
Yep.
I got to keep them in it. And, it's going to be close, but obviously easier said than done, but they got to just focus in on Derrick Henry, limiting him. If they can limit him to 120 yards, I think that's a win. Which is kind of crazy to say, but if you can give him, only to 120, cap it there, I think that their offense, the Ravens offense, has done enough that, they've gone back to the ground game that they can control the clock and win 27-24.
If you asked me about 4 weeks ago who would win this matchup, I wouldn't even think twice. It would be the Titans. 4 weeks ago, the Ravens weren't even in the playoffs at that point. Looking forward, they did not have a great projection, but the way that their offense has turned it around, and we just went through the matchups. If you take Derrick Henry off of this football team, I think the Ravens have the edge in just about every single other category. So I don't know how I can't pick against the Ravens in this one. I do think it'll be pretty high scoring, especially with that leaky Tennessee defense. So I'm going to say probably 38-28.
And I will take the Ravens as well. I think it's going to be a really close game, though. I think it's actually going to be a little lower scoring game just because I think everybody's going to run the ball. And so I think the clock, there's going to be 8-minute possessions for touchdowns. So I'm going to go Ravens 21-20. So we all took the Ravens on this one. But
yeah, I was going to say, I thought it was kind of coming out hot with a Ravens take, and nope, you guys just followed suit. And I was like, okay, sounds good.
But that's all we got for this game. So make sure you comment below on who you think will win this matchup. And until next time, see you then.
Peace.